Caymanians. Included but not limited to are the supports for our most vulnerable students. These measures include those with special education needs as social, emotional, behavioral, and mental needs. Opportunities for learning extended to parents and guardians. Promotion of our exceptional youth on every possible platform. And proud of them was just but one example affording to mention. That we have engaged, as I've indicated, in public-private partnerships, which have created networking opportunities and internships, mentoring, and scholarships. We've given second chances for success through SciFec. There have been opportunities for early entry to post-secondary studies, and there have been a range of scholarships to the tune of under $12 million for our local and overseas scholarships, as well as TVET and medical specialization getting separate appropriations. Mr. Speaker, you see, we recognize the important role that education plays for individuals and for any community. We strive to ensure that students are given every opportunity for success, and we are able to overcome the barriers to education that arise. In sports, we are full of cognizance that most of the young people can and do excel in sports. And we're happy that we're having the opportunity and the finances to host Carifta here next year, which we hope that will serve as a tool where iron can sharpen iron and get more of our local athletes and want-to-bes involved in sports, as we have seen that there have been a number of sports grants, not just from our ministry, but as universities from overseas come. Many of our Caymanian students are now getting the opportunity to go overseas to play basketball, to do track and other athletics. We see that these grants that we've given to the youth as well provides opportunities, Mr. Speaker, for our young people, and I'm sure you're more than familiar with that, having been the author of many of these policies from previous years. They allow our young people to take part in a variety of positive activities that provide a safe harbor, mentoring, networking, and a positive role models, to name a few. Through these connections, Mr. Speaker, young people learn to give back to their community. They get exposed to different pathways. They learn different positive social habits that may differ from the experience that many of them may be having at home. Mr. Speaker, our authorities that are under the ministry are not left out. In fact, the Water Authority gives a yearly scholarship of 30,000 Cayman Islands dollars per year for a maximum of 4 years. And when they come back, they're bonded to the Water Authority to work. So unless something really goes astray, they can come back and find a job and gain experience at the Water Authority. In fact, I also wish to report here and now that the Water Authority, commencing early next year, will be offering a new scholarship to the tune of $25,000 for locals to attend UCCI. So we recognize that perhaps some of our students will not have reached that academic level that they can pursue tertiary education overseas. So the Water Authority has come on board as one of our statutory authorities to partner and to offer $25,000, which is even more than we are able to do in the ministry, with a tune of $12,000 for UCCI scholarship recipients. We also see, Mr. Speaker, that there is much training that the Water Authority does, and a lot of the vocational opportunities there are the more manual ones, but there's also provision for the more scientific lab. Just recently, we've had one of the students from the BRAC who attended and did exceptionally well at University of Florida come back, and yes, there was not that type of white-collar job in the BRAC, but Water Authority took them in on his own merit, and from what I understand, is doing extremely well there and their lab. Mr. Speaker, we also give assistance to our farmers, recognizing that not everybody will be bankers or accountants. We have to continue to promote to eat what you grow and grow what you eat, and the farm-to-table movement in Cayman has been increasing, Mr. Speaker. We need to produce food that are safe and that are free from preservatives, that are fresh, And we have many farmers right here in Cayman, and I was delighted to see that we are getting more young farmers, as well as there's a better gender balance with farming as well. It does my heart good as I go around to see the farm visits and see some of the women who've gone back to from whence we came and are farming and go to the farmers market on Saturday. So we're not only looking at those who are in active engagement and opportunity, but some civil service who've retired have gone back to the land and are farming and be able to help support themselves. And we're very excited about this. We see this field in agriculture as another area, Mr. Speaker, for an opportunity to encourage young persons to build careers, and as this has potentially a lucrative field, seeing that more persons are becoming more cognizant and sensitive of the need to take better care of their bodies and eat much more healthy. Mr. Speaker, as it relates to TVET, currently TVET subjects are offered at our government high schools and at the Cayman Islands Further Education Center, or CIFEC. This is to encourage students to pursue the TVET careers. And many of our young people, Mr. Speaker, thrive in these fields where they have an opportunity to work with their hands. Funding is ring-fenced in scholarships for persons interested in TVET tertiary education. And there have been some persons, Mr. Speaker. We also encourage our career counselors to explain and to justify why it is not a crime to enter into the TVET world, because it does pay very well, even here in the Cayman jurisdiction. Mr. Speaker, also I found in entering the ministry that the early childhood education grants were in existence, but there was a time cut off for when applications could be made. And because oftentimes financial hardship is not something that is easily foreseeable, one of the first policy changes that we decided to put into vogue was to open it up so that if an unforeseeable financial strain came on the parent, they would not be denied that once they met the criteria for our early childhood recipients to get the necessary funding that they needed to get. Because you see, Mr. Speaker, long have gone the day when they can just stay home and play doll house. We realize that the sooner we get our children exposed to proper education programs and policies that are implemented, the better chance we will have to successfully nation build. We saw also, Mr. Speaker, need for the early childhood care and the educational grants, as I alluded to, and the ministry offers grants to Caymanians, Mr. Speaker, who cannot afford this early childhood care or education for their children. These are children who may otherwise would have been left at home without the opportunity to socialize and begin their early learning skills. We increased funding for ECAP as the needs grew to ensure that all Caymanians who qualified could be granted funds. And we started what is referred to as the roll-in application rather than to cap the application process or period. Mr. Speaker, we realize that these are necessary building blocks for our future success. If we can close the learning gaps for children at this very early and sensitive and relevant age, then we can help to ensure that all of our Caymanian students are able to make substantial progress, perform much better than their peers. It is opportunities such as these, Mr. Speaker, that it will allow our children to change their standing in our society. As we educate our people, we empower them, Mr. Speaker. We set the standard for generations to come. Then, Mr. Speaker, we recognize that social mobility is not just a social problem, but an economic imperative as well. Economic growth, I submit, Mr. Speaker, is the engine of social mobility as it creates jobs and improves real incomes. Economic growth in Cayman is an absolute necessity as it enables our government to increase its revenue intake. Therefore, it improves its ability to invest in our human capital and needed infrastructure. In the Cayman model, Mr. Speaker, inward investment has been our bread and butter, and it offers enhanced opportunities for government to enable children to be better off than their parents were. educational or otherwise, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe that after all, it's economic growth that creates these necessary jobs that assist families in meeting their various needs. Hence the need for the government to have put so much emphasis in investing in necessary infrastructure, not just for today, Mr. Speaker, but for decades to come. There must, however, be a balance as the absence of social mobility can often curb economic growth. What do I mean by that, Mr. Speaker? The Bible tells us that the poor will always be with us. But it did not say that we should help create a permanent welfare class in the Cayman Islands. And this is where the balance becomes very delicate. That is, Mr. Speaker, we must teach our people to fish. We must give them a hand up, not a handout and a fish, as it were. To do otherwise, Mr. Speaker, would create a generation of poverty. And so this government has concentrated its efforts in investing in pre-K education, interventional education strategies and implementation of the same, investing in necessary infrastructure, which just isn't roads, by the way, Mr. Speaker. We have committed to building a new high school in Georgetown. We've extended other schools. We have committed and voted money for improvement of our sporting facilities. I have given a long list in my September and August educational speech as to the additional posts once we found that some 20% of classes were in need of special intervention. We did an additional 10 posts to meet these needs because we realize that education plays a very vital role in social mobility. Nation building, Mr. Speaker, and social mobility has been a catalyst and a relevant consideration as we create and implement policy and investment in education in this country. And I'm forever grateful to the government and my colleagues on the other side for the support that they've given for the funding that is necessary to carry out these programs and policies. So, Mr. Speaker, while we agree that in a perfect world, in a utopia, where time is not of the essence, that we could have supported the request from my honorable friend on the other side for a more in-depth or forensic study, we believe that it's of a nature where, as the momentum is going as far as it relates to education and the policies and the support from both sides of the aisles and the funding that is given to support this, that we certainly, in education, can continue on meeting those needs rather than waiting for another time. And so, Mr. Speaker, we believe that we have not yet perfected it. We have not arrived, but we certainly are cognizant of the needs that we find as we travel from school to school in all three of the islands, as we talk, and I also get requests from across the aisles. We believe that perhaps the better methodology at this particular junction is for all members of this honorable House to not allow education to become a political football. And I want to go on record to thank all members for resisting that temptation, because we all find education to be important as a necessary tool for social mobility. And I hope and pray that as we work together, that we, as history records the contribution of each member here today, that we can easily say that we would have left this campground, education in particular as it relates to my ministry, much better than we found it. And if the time comes that we feel we need to have a review after having done what we are aware that's needed to be done, then that is for consideration in due course. But as for now, the Education Minister feels that we've identified the needs. We believe that it's more than education. There is social needs, as I indicated in my contribution. But I believe the greatest need that this country has, even more than a study, is for people in this country to return to the old paths, because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And when we don't fear the Lord, we lose all boundaries. So I would ask all members, as they have come together and from a collaborative effort, to ensure that the support is there, that we've removed politics from supporting of education because it's of paramount consideration, that we too in our own 19 constituents would take time through our lives and through our examples, through our support, to promote Christian living, because irrespective of what is said, it is He who have founded these islands upon the seas and established it. And if a nation to have a godly vision, we must have a God. I thank you for this opportunity. I apologize for it being so late at night. I also apologize to the member and to the fact that it may be seen as negating his motion, but I would ask that he would not see it as that, but he would see it that his thirst and his desire for education to be playing the pivotal role in social mobility is what the government also considers. And it does not just take a vote on this floor or a motion, because most motions go into archive along various governments, but we are committed to the same upward mobility and social mobility. And certainly from the Minister of Education and my colleagues, we are committed to work with all members, because at the end of the day, it's not opposition government, it's a Caymanian thing. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I'm not taking sides. I'm noticing a very, very good speech. I think the member enjoyed it himself. Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? If not, I'll call on the mover for his right of reply.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. Sorry.
Sarge. I think we'll give way to the Honourable Minister of Financial Services.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Just very briefly, to also recognize and to say what has been said on this side. The government certainly appreciates the sentiments of what is expressed, as in the concerns about the social mobility of our people. And as has been pointed out by my colleagues before, we certainly have taken definitive action to achieve that in a number of areas, from employment to education to social welfare. And Mr. Speaker, I just want to speak briefly about a segment of society that many people may not even think as being, quote unquote, eligible to be considered in social mobility, and that is those of our prison population. But Mr. Speaker, I think it's very important that we do highlight that as a government, we don't give up on any of our people, no matter where they find themselves, even if they have, in this instance, climbed the ladder of social mobility in the wrong direction and have ended up in being incarcerated or in the criminal justice system. And so, Mr. Speaker, certainly from the Ministry of Home Affairs perspective, there are some key activities, key programs, key strategies key elements of what is being discussed here today, which is to try to ensure that those who have the misfortune of spending time in the criminal justice system and ending up in Her Majesty's prison service will no longer see that as the viable option or activities of choice to end them as being their only stop on the social mobility ladder. So, Mr. Speaker, with respect to the Department of Community Rehabilitation and Her Majesty's Cayman Islands Prison Services, two key agencies that work very closely to fulfill the mandate that this government has not only adopted but promoted and has significantly funded and increased their funding in this year's budget in particular to address the very same needs as it relates to the upward mobility of those persons who hopefully will be in a position to take advantage of these opportunities upon release. There are particular programs, Mr. Speaker, services and interventions designed to target the underlying causes of offending behavior. And I think, again, that goes to the heart of what is kind of being asked for in this motion, which is to try to determine what those causes are. And in many respects, as my colleagues have said before, there have been a number of studies. The mover himself made reference to certain studies that have been done. But I want to reassure the members of this Honourable House and the listening public that this government certainly has had the opportunity to review a number of these studies. We have commissioned some of these studies ourselves in previous iterations, in previous government administrations, and we certainly are committed to moving these forward, moving the needle forward to achieve what the outcome and the findings of these studies have already told us as a government, as a people, as a country. And so, Mr. Speaker, the aim is to have a positive impact on the access for opportunities for, as I said in the case of the prison population, certainly for upward social mobility. And, Mr. Speaker, just speaking very briefly to some of the attitudes, some of the strategies and interventions, we know that attitude determines altitude in many respects. And we also know, Mr. Speaker, that many of the causes for people's negative outcomes is as a result of attitudes and attitudinal and other perspective issues and how they manage emotions, etc. And so, Mr. Speaker, one of the key programs that are being carried out in the prison service itself for those who are incarcerated, in collaboration with the Department of Community Rehabilitation, aims to address what we know is, in many respects, a scourge in our community. Not just our community, Mr. Speaker. Many communities have to deal with the issue of violence, and gender violence in particular, in many respects, but violence more broadly in terms of how people handle and how people respond to conflict. Because conflict is always around us, Mr. Speaker. But in order to be able to manage and then control our responses to conflict, in many ways determines the outcome of our actions taken. And so, Mr. Speaker, there is a particular program that has been introduced recently within the prison service, as I said, and it's the Men's Nonviolence Program, where it is for perpetrators of domestic violence. It is a court-approved, accredited program, and it meets best practice standards, Mr. Speaker. Those who begin the program in prison can complete it with the Department of Community Rehabilitation upon release. So this was a program that initially started for those who were already released from prison, but we saw the need to move this within the prison walls so we cannot wait until they're out of prison and expect them to have the skills necessary to reintegrate into the community. So we are taking the concept of social mobility right to the root of where it needs to be addressed from the time they're actually in and have been in the system. Mr. Speaker, not forgetting the needs specific to some of our female incarcerated populations, there have also been targeted strategies and interventions which have actually come to play to deal with issues related to women and inspiring and women empowerment issues in alignment with a goal to implement more gender-specific services for adult female offenders. Again, Mr. Speaker, these particular programs and strategies are as a result of a targeted approach to case management services offered to our prison population. Mr. Speaker, the issue of mental health has been addressed, mental health amongst our children, as we heard, mental health in many other areas, but certainly the prison population is no less affected, and in many respects people end up in prison as a result of mental health related issues. And so, Mr. Speaker, the prison service has an MOU with the Health Services Authority, which ensures that male and female offenders with mental illness receive some support from a psychiatrist on a weekly basis. Additional counseling and support is also provided to members of the prison by members of the prison rehabilitation team who collaborate with external mental health professionals. There is also a number of drug rehabilitation programs, Mr. Speaker, and again, many of the same reasons that they end up in being in jail or in prison as a result has to do with either drug use or drug-related offenses. And so, Mr. Speaker, working very closely with the National Drug Council and the Department of Counselling Services, which also sits under the auspices of the Ministry of Health, there are programs that are in place to assist those offenders who are struggling with these addictions. And again, to motivate positive behavior, Mr. Speaker, I had the opportunity of visiting the prison and seeing firsthand some of the kinds of strategies that are being employed to try to incentivize prisoners to try to live and adopt drug-free lifestyles by having certain privileges afforded to them while they're incarcerated, if they do and they maintain. And actually, and in this case, it extends to, smoking and tobacco, there's a tobacco-free wing of the prison now, which honestly, the conditions seem to be very much night and day in terms of your ability to breathe without having to feel the constraints of tobacco in the air. So again, there is the kind of practical strategies that are being implemented to try to motivate positive behavior, even amongst those that people in the community may be thinking that there shouldn't be such an investment and there shouldn't be such a focus on. And I really want to stop here and pause, Mr. Speaker, because I often hear a lot of times in various quarters that, the government's focus on economic growth and economic development and prosperity somehow seems to be mutually exclusive from focusing on the needs and the development of the most vulnerable. And I also want to reiterate what my colleague, the Minister of Education, just said about the need for growth and continued investment and for economic opportunities in order to be able to uplift and lift and focus on providing the needs of the most vulnerable. And in this respect, Mr. Speaker, certainly as Minister with responsibility for Home Affairs in this instance and speaking on these issues, the government was very supportive of the requests that were made and is reflected in the budget as it relates to the increased investment in our most vulnerable population in many respects when it comes to the adult population, who oftentimes find themselves in the vicious cycle of in and out of prison. And so certainly this, as was done previously, but now because of the fact that we were able to afford to do so in a situation where we were being able to increase the budget allocation because of meeting the various ratios and everything, we as a government took the decision to make that investment. So I don't want anybody to think, and again here I wear two hats, financial services on one hand and Home Affairs on the other. But for me, actually, it works very well because I'm able to focus on helping to build and develop an industry that is so vital to our economy, but actually I'm also able to help to deliver on the government's mandate to focus on a population that in many respects are often the forgotten and often the ones where people feel that there shouldn't be as much investment. But Mr. Speaker, as I said before, this government recognizes the need to not write anybody off because you never know where and who they may end up if those opportunities are given. And that is why we are so adamant to make sure that from cradle to grave and everywhere in between, and if you fall off the bandwagon, you're given the opportunity. But of course, it does require taking initiative, because as they say, you can take to the horse to the water, but you can't make them drink. Well, we want to make sure the water is abundantly available as best as possible so people can then make that decision. So that's a bit of a digression on that particular point, Mr. Speaker, but I think it was an important one because I don't want anybody to think that because we are a business-friendly perspective, because we know and understand and appreciate that the government needs money to operate, and that means putting a focus and an emphasis on incentivizing business opportunities. It doesn't mean in one shape or form that we do not care about investing in our people. Jobs and employment is a result of business opportunities coming and remaining in the country. And Mr. Speaker, speaking of jobs and employment, that moves on to the next point that I want to make, and that is the relationship, the partnership that has been developed and is being strengthened and will hopefully continue under the new iteration, and I know is intended to continue under the new iteration of the work program, and that is the employability skills program that was launched with the National Workforce Development Agency previously, which addresses various aspects of employment readiness for our incarcerated population. Again, Mr. Speaker, the goal is to work with the prison to register all inmates who would be then transitioning to the community for employment and future employment opportunities, and working with them before they leave the service in order to better prepare them for the upward social mobility that we hope and expect them to achieve. Mr. Speaker, my colleague mentioned the various education focuses for our at-risk children and youth in the system currently, but we haven't forgotten about our prison population either. The Department of Education has collaborated with the prison to ensure that the incarcerated youth have been doing the British Technical Education Program, the BTEC program, so that they can continue their classes while in prison. Mr. Speaker, for those incarcerated adults who need to develop the skills and the ability to, as I said, transition from being inmates and wards of the states to productive citizens in our society, there are a number of employment programs that have also started and are being continued. We have the Fresh Start program, which works very closely with 3 local construction companies, in particular Phoenix, Clan Construction, and Encompass, who have partnered with the prison services in 2017 to implement the program. And phase 1 of the pilot was successfully completed that year. And again, Mr. Speaker, I was recently told about the continuation and how the service is actually helping to build the infrastructure within the prison itself. So they're taking responsibility to develop the skills of how to build and construct, but they're turning it to actual practical use to better their own environment while being incarcerated, so for developing technical workshop facilities, etc. It provides prisoners with an opportunity to work alongside qualified company leaders for 8 weeks to gain hands-on instruction in a trade as well as required skills to obtain employment in the industry. And Mr. Speaker, the program has continued with some participants actually being offered employment upon release. And as far as I know, all but one continue to be employed with those companies as a result of that program. So again, the social mobility is alive and well within the auspices of that emerging and developing program. And I would now make a plea to any other construction companies who would want to take advantage of the real desire amongst the prison population to learn and develop those skills. Reach out to Her Majesty's Prison and the prison director to see what can be done to further enhance that program so more and more inmates can take advantage of those opportunities. Mr. Speaker, the Needs Assessment Unit. My colleague, the councillor for the Ministry of Community Affairs, spoke about the plans in terms of developing community services. The NAU, in recognition of the important role that stable and affordable housing plays, the prison has established a partnership with NAU to enabling housing issues to be addressed. Again, that sort of, if you don't have a place to stay, once you're incarcerated, there is this fear of how am I going to survive outside on my own? Well, that partnership, hopefully, Mr. Speaker, will help to address and alleviate some of those concerns, real issues that real people in those situations find themselves in on a day-in, day-out basis. If you don't have a place to stay, you don't have the ability to integrate back into society, then there is a much higher likelihood of you being right back where you ended up in the first place. So that program is something that we look forward to continuing the partnership with under the revamped and revitalized system that is being introduced. Mr. Speaker, there has been an exciting program launched recently in partnership with the Ministry of Commerce and in particular the National Roads Authority, and it came out of a pilot program that the prison introduced initially in partnership with the DEH as the Inmates Road Party, where they would work with members of the DEH staff to assist in kind of the ad hoc projects of being able to help with the cleaning of the community beaches and roadways. And this was something that was piloted in the fall of 2017. It became very successful in its own right, and participants are on what would be considered low risk to go into the community. It is a supervised program, and it's ongoing. There's some other exciting news, but I certainly won't break it here just yet today. I'll save something for later on that myself and Minister for Health will be able to announce, but it is a program that has recently just taken off again that gives even more opportunities to address a number of issues: work opportunities, garbage collection, etc. So again, Mr. Speaker, the NRA program, as I alluded to, that now is a formalized program with the NRA that actually helps to ensure that there is a consistent relationship and a consistent work supply to help to remove debris from areas scheduled for roadside maintenance. It's a way that this government has not just found a way to be innovative in addressing real concerns, but actually providing opportunities, real opportunities for social mobility. And a big part of that is developing a sense of responsibility, a sense of commitment, work ethic, and the like. And certainly amongst the prison population, this is something that in many respects is an area that needs to be focused on because of maybe lack of employment history for many of them in the past. Mr. Speaker, education, as I said, is something that continues to be a focus within the prison. They're looking to develop literacy skills, IT basic training, small business training. There's actual formal CXC courses that are offered: math, English, human, and social biology, online occupational certificates and diplomas. We actually wanted to visit, that is, the governor and I wanted to visit a particular, one of the units in the TVET areas, but they were in the middle of a course, an online course, and we didn't want to interfere. So these are things that I'm not just hearing about or being told to me. I've actually had the opportunity to visit and see firsthand things are happening now. And some of the issues and concerns that we heard previously was the lack of consistency in these areas. It is still an issue. The TVET program still needs to be enhanced, but we're making steps to do so. Staff has been hired, additional focus has been placed, and additional resources allocated specifically to ensure that this stays a priority as part of the rehabilitation program that is now an integral part of the prison service expectation. And so, Mr. Speaker, the prison is actively exploring opportunities to partner with external agencies to expand these offerings. And again, I once again put in a plea to those agencies. If you want to contribute to the social mobility, there are many opportunities to do so. The government is committed to investing in doing so, and we certainly appreciate and value the partners that we have developed along the way. Mr. Speaker, there are many, many, many other opportunities for me to speak to, and I will just give the highlights because I know the night is long, it's late. But, Mr. Speaker, we need people to understand that when we say we are not accepting this motion, it's not because we don't believe in what the motion is trying to achieve, and that is addressing the needs of our people. And we've addressed the needs of our people in many areas, and we will continue to do so and work so collaboratively and we really hope that we can do so in the spirit of cooperation with every member in this community, because no person has the monopoly on knowledge, passion, or enthusiasm. But as a collective, we've shown that we've managed to address, tackle, and work towards achieving great things for our people, including our most vulnerable adult population, who are the incarcerated people today, hopefully the entrepreneurs, the high flyers of tomorrow. Thank you.
Member from Newlands, I think. Member from Newlands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, I'd first like to thank all honorable members who've contributed to this debate. Well, I think it's been made quite clear that the government is not going to accept the motion. It's funny, Mr. Speaker, the Premier is saying we don't need any more studies, but I think that only happens is only used when it's convenient, because I think this government has spent millions on consultant reports to support a cruise project. Mr. Speaker, I'm struggling to respond to all the comments that were made, because some were quite useful. And at the very least, I think this motion gave the government an opportunity to showcase some of what they have been doing. And I think from the beginning, when I got up, Mr. Speaker, I said that this wasn't intended to be a political move or motion. It wasn't. Despite what the Premier may think, we, as the Minister of Education has said, with regard to education, no, I do things my way. I'm not worried about that. This is an opportunity for us to show that we won't make things like education political. We have done that, I think, across the aisle. We haven't engaged on a level that I think would be political when it comes to things like education. And the minister pointed out some very good things that are being done in education. I have to agree with her, with our support. What I am concerned about, Mr. Speaker, and in asking for a social mobility report, it is, what I'm trying to get at is that we need to get beyond reacting to issues that come up and getting more to a point where we are being proactive. And yes, some of the things the government are doing are aimed towards achieving that. But I'll use the example of the prisons. Not that I'm criticizing what the minister said, but the point of social mobility and understanding the underlying root cause is that so that people don't go to prison. So we're doing a lot for them when they get to prison. But the point is, let's prevent them from getting to prison. Same thing with at-risk youth. We need to be proactive enough to prevent them from becoming at risk. So that's where this whole motion was going. Not that I brought it to highlight anything the government wasn't doing. I brought it so that the government could choose to use it as a tool to enhance what they're doing. So I understand that a lot is being done. But the fact remains, when you look at the government's own reports, the ESO reports and so on, things are not, we're not seeing that rapid improvement in the statistics to show the living conditions, the current conditions of Caymanians. There are many Caymanians who are doing well. This focuses on that segment of the population that are not. And that is where I think we need the help. There are reports out there, there are experts in the government. However, and this is based on experience, and not, it's inevitable, when you have separate ministries, you end up sometimes getting into this sort of siloed approach where one entity is doing something, another one is doing something else. What this report would do is bring it all together. So the member from Prospect talked about reorganizing in his area, things that they're doing to address some of the underlying root causes, changing legislation, and so forth. But before we get to that stage, we need to understand better, I think, why we need to improve these things, what's driving the issues created that we're responding to. So I think that, you know, just based on what I know of the, for example, Yolanda Ford report, such a report could have been created, and I'll be very generous when I say within a year. I don't think the cost would have been significant. I would guesstimate something like this could be done for less than $100,000. And that's, again, being generous. But I don't want to be too specific. But it would arm the government. When the government is going forward and is supporting development, supporting initiatives that bring benefits for Caymanians, it would arm you to know that what you're doing for the people with the best intentions, it would give you that much more confidence in knowing how it will eventually trickle down or benefit Caymanians. So it's a tool, I mean, and it's a suggestion, Mr. Speaker. And if the government doesn't want to go that route now, that's the government's choice. I can only bring the suggestions forward, put them forward on the floor of this House, and we vote on it. But I am a bit disappointed because I think the main argument that I was making was missed throughout. I think that members were viewing this as a reactionary exercise when it's more an exercise in being proactive and looking much deeper into what it is that affects the social mobility of Caymanians. We can't, no one can, Mr. Speaker, raise their hand right now and say what is the probability of a young Caymanian born into a poor Caymanian family today that they will, what is the likelihood that they will end up moving up, say for example from poor to middle class throughout the course of their life? No one can say that. We don't know, we don't have any clue what that likelihood is. And that is the core of what I'm suggesting here tonight, Mr. Speaker, is that we need to know that. And until we know that, if you don't know where you're coming from, you don't know where you're going. And this is why countries like the United Kingdom, United States, Canada, all the developed nations have invested in this exercise and taken it seriously because it has armed them with the knowledge that they need. It may be considered being critical of yourself for a while because it may highlight things you are doing wrong, but it gives you the opportunity to correct them and move forward. So I heard the members on the other side. I heard the points of view. I still think that for the cost, the effort involved, this would still be a useful exercise and a tool that the government can use to inform their policies and decisions going forward. It doesn't sound like the government will accept it, Mr. Speaker, but I put it forward as an option. So with that, I want to thank all members who supported on this side. And I want to thank all members who contributed and gave their reasons for not supporting it. And I can only say I am a bit disappointed. However, at least I got up and made the suggestion. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The question is that be it therefore resolved that the government consider commissioning an independent study of the factors affecting the social mobility of Caymanians in the Cayman Islands with a view to using this information to inform government policy, to identify and recommend treatment of the root causes of social and economic divisions and other related issues, and to assist in developing the country in a manner which promotes, protects, and empowers Caymanians, taking into special consideration the social needs of the Caymanian people. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against?
No.
The noes have it.
Can we have a division, please, Mr. Speaker?
Clerk.
Honourable Alda McLaughlin.
No.
Honourable Moses Kirkconnell. Honourable Juliana O'Connor Connolly.
No.
Honourable Dwayne Seymour.
No.
Honourable Roy McTaggart.
No.
Honourable Joseph Hugh. Honourable Tara Rivers. Honourable Barney Bush. Captain Eugene Ebanks. Captain Eugene Ebanks.
He said no.
I hear nothing.
He didn't hear us. Shout it out.
You got to turn yours off, David.
Harris has his own.
We support now.
No.
Miss Barbara Connolly.
No.
Mr. David White.
No.
Mr. Austin Harris.
No.
Honourable Ezra Miller. Mr. Alva Saku.
Aye.
Mr. Kenneth Bryan. Mr. Anthony Eden.
Aye.
Mr. Christopher Saunders. Mr. Arden McLean.
Aye.
Results of the division. 4 ayes, 11 noes, 3 absentees. The motion is defeated. Sarge.
Private member motion number 5, National Flood Water Management Plan, to be moved by the elected member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to move the motion standing in my name on the order paper number 5, 2018-2019, labeled as National Flood Management Plan. Apologies, Mr. Speaker. And it reads as such. Whereas flooding relating to heavy rains, storms, and other sources continue to be a major concern for residents of the Cayman Islands, and whereas many Caymanians are losing property and property values amounting to millions of dollars due to flooding issues, and whereas the government's approach to dealing with storm and rainwater drainage is not comprehensive and lacks a clear national plan, and whereas the government's current ad hoc approach to dealing with flooding issues is not effective or efficient, be it therefore resolved that the government considers creating a national flood management plan, and be it further resolved that the government considers allocating resources to implement and execute the national flood management plan, including the requisite legislation, regulation, and policies.
Elected member for Newlands.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to second the motion.
The motion is open for debate. Honourable member from Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to first start by thanking the Honourable Acting Opposition Leader, the elected member for Newlands, for seconding this motion, which I hope this Honourable House will take serious considerations too. Mr. Speaker, as you heard in my reading of the motion, it's pretty straightforward and speaks about the foundation of what I intend to address. All members of this Honourable House, one way, shape, or form, probably knows somebody or probably have been affected themselves in some way by flooding, either through the annual rain, the annual rains scheduling per year, rainy season, or by a possible hurricane that has passed through the Cayman Islands. I think most of us were probably here in the Cayman Islands when Ivan passed through and remembers not only the damage that it caused by the severe winds, but also by the major flooding afterwards. And Mr. Speaker, flooding has been an issue in Cayman for as long as the Cayman Islands has been recorded. And it's because, Mr. Speaker, that our island is flat. And though we don't know what God's plan was when he was making this beautiful island, or was it different in any other capacity many hundreds and thousands of years ago, but we know within our recent history it's always been flat. And with those, with the lay of the land here, we all know that there's zones and areas that are a major concern. And Mr. Speaker, the dangers of flooding for many Caymanians is real and something that many Caymanians fear every year. Those dangers are from a safety standpoint sometimes, and thank God it's not too bad from a safety standpoint, but it's mainly from damage to Caymanians' main asset, which is their home. Most people, the average Caymanian, the biggest asset they'll ever own in their life is their home. And unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, year in and year out, we hear the cries and concerns of citizens in our society that either the yard is flooded out, and depending on that year and the severity of the rain, we may have people who have rain that come into their homes, and then we hear a cry for help and assistance for either home repairs or furnishings and the like. Mr. Speaker, we've heard even more severe than that, whereby past administrations have spent much of the public's purse trying to save communities, and in the tens of thousands, if my memory serves me well, if not in the hundreds of thousands, trying to save communities. And many administrations have talked about having a plan, have suggested that we should have a plan, but there never seems to have been one actually developed. And Mr. Speaker, all this motion is asking for, quite similar like the last one, is let's all the agencies across the Cayman Islands who work with flooding in one way, shape, or form, either directly or indirectly by regulations or planning or by assistance through roads or by the evaluation of the water levels, whatever agency or hazard management from a concern of safety, all of these agencies, why not let's get them together, sit down, and create a national plan on how we deal with flooding in the Cayman Islands. Now, Mr. Speaker, we do, as you heard in my motion, do some things for flooding in the Cayman Islands, and most people may know that we do drains, and thank goodness there have been some administrations that have put in some culvert systems as strategies to alleviate certain spots. But again, like what my motion suggests, it's an ad hoc approach. There's no scientific studies behind how to address this national problem that is not going to go away, because the Cayman Islands is not going to grow off of sea level anytime soon, unless the Lord sees that as a way to save us. So this is not going to go away. But these ad hoc approaches is not alleviating the fears and concerns of many Caymanians year in, year out, worried about flooding and damaging their properties. And this reminds me of a conversation, Mr. Speaker, with one of my constituents who is in a rather peculiar position today, Mr. Speaker, whereby when they built their home some 31 years ago, the property around them was dry and things were nice. The garden was good. The trees were beautiful and the kids would play outside. Thankfully now for this constituent of mine, their kids have now grown and left the nest, so to speak. But wanting to get away from the hassle and bustle of the Georgetown area, that homeowner wanted to sell the property. But since they bought the property some 30-odd years ago to now, the development in the Georgetown area has increased so much that the flow of water within the Georgetown area has been changed, has been misdirected from its natural flow, from the natural flow of what it was 31 years ago. So the circumstances of water settlement is now different for that homeowner. So much so different that every single rainy season, you can set your clock on it, they will be flooded out for at least 3 to 4 months of the year. And I'm talking about flooding to a point where if a rain comes for one night, they're flooded for at least 3 to 4 days. And if they get a sun break from the sun coming back out and it'll dry up, by the time the next rain comes, it's constantly off and on. Unfortunately, this constituent is not in the financial position like some others to go and buy, fill, and uplift their property to make sure they're not flooding, getting into their home. But, Mr. Speaker, that constituent also had to deal with Ivan, whereby because of the area, the whole house was flooded out. So any little bit of savings they had, much of that was lost through that time period. And within their senior years, never got a chance to get that money back in the savings account. So much of it was already lost. And these are the types of situations that many Caymanians not only have to deal with, but are fearful of. And Mr. Speaker, we know the importance of a person's home and the security mentally of that home by way of protecting its value. Because most Caymanians who are getting up in their age, the first thing they'll say is, you know, I want to leave my house to my kids. But unfortunately for this constituent of mine, the house can't even be sold. The bank won't even give them insurance. So they can't even sell the property to even move out of the area. And I'm just giving you a little bit of narrative of examples of situations that we have in the country. And Mr. Speaker, while thinking about this problem that I think we all know about, I tried to think about what options are currently in play for Cayman and whether they're substantial enough to deal with the problem of our low-lying area and the fact that we constantly get rain and, God forbid, if we get a hurricane, the severity of a potential damage to people's property. And the more I examined or investigated into the various different departments, it was clear to me that there is no national strategy at all. Now, obviously, I thought that was not appropriate for our developing country, so I took a look at other jurisdictions. And it blows my mind, Mr. Speaker, that now that we are such a developed first world country, that so many other countries have a national plan in respect to flooding or a national strategy in respect to flooding, but we in the Cayman Islands with such great economy and such great surpluses that we're not focusing on this element. Just for example, just by a simple Google search of how many countries that has a national flood plan. England, United States, Canada, China, India, Indonesia, Russia, Germany, and a lot of the smaller other nation states that locally, because I know people will say, well, okay, those are big old countries, right? Just locally around us, smaller countries, Jamaica, Trinidad, Tobago, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Honduras, even Cuba, which many people may seem to think that are third world countries, but they put the priority on making sure that from a flooding perspective, people are safe. Now, Mr. Speaker, I'll say this though, I recognize the difference between those countries and us, because in some flooding strategies, people have to deal with flooding from high hills and rivers and the like. But though we may not have all the similarities of those countries, many of those countries will also have some of the problems that we have in respect to areas that are below sea level or areas of settling water from rain and from storms, particularly here in the Caribbean region. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think it's important that I highlight some of the areas that are constantly under threat that I'm aware of, and just to give an example of how many problems that we have. And I'm going to try to, for the purposes of our members to think about their own voters, I'm going to list them out, and I'm going to do it by constituency. Starting with my own, obviously. First, Martin Drive, North Sound Road, Canal Lane, Winford Close, Alamo Drive, Cranbrook Drive, Alto Way, most of Tropical Gardens, much of Palmdale, all of these areas in Georgetown Central, and all of them have some sort of level of flooding at certain times of the year, and for sure have flooding if there is ever a hurricane. Number two, Georgetown North, Washington Street, or is it Washington Boulevard, better known as Swamp Boulevard? Boulevard, right? Washington Boulevard, better known as Swamp, constant flooding, even with the slightest amount of rain. Parkside Close, which is considered to be a middle class and above neighborhood. The house values, I think, is no less than $300,000 in that area. And the average could actually probably be closer to $400,000 to $500,000. So not only is this for persons who are in low income, but people in high income as well who are dealing with this problem. Windsor Park, Anthony Drive, Oakmeal Street, all in Georgetown West or Georgetown South. And we all have constituents there. Bel Air Drive, which is another area in, I believe Bel Air Drive falls in Georgetown South. It's either Georgetown South or Georgetown East. Constant flooding. Fairbanks, Randnight Gardens, we spoke about that earlier this week. Constant flooding. Selkirk Drive in the Red Bay area. Victory Avenue and Prospect, always a bit of a flooding problem with rain. Many roads within the Prospect area, which there's so many that I couldn't possibly list them, but Prospect in itself, many routes, I'm quite sure the members of that area, particularly Red Bay and Prospect, will be aware of some of those roads that have flooding. North Sound Estates, Frank Hall Homes in Savannah, North Sound Gardens, these are all in Newlands and Savannah area. Lookout Gardens, Belford Estates in Bontown East. Now these are just some areas, and I really haven't gone any further than Georgetown District and Bontown District. And I'm certain that there is some areas probably in West Bay that have flooding issues, some in East End and some in North Side, and the sister islands. But this just is an example of how many areas that have Caymanians who constantly have to worry about flooding. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want you to think about a young Caymanian who builds a home, takes the only savings at age 30 years old, builds their house, put all their money into their home, and then to have it being flooded out because there's not a particular strategy around the country, and because of development, which is not a bad thing, development is a good thing for the country, but without measured development and watching these concerns of the water flows, it could affect other people's property. And I think everybody in this House, Mr. Speaker, have heard of scenarios where a person built a house first and 10 or 5 years later, their property is flooded out. Now, I think this is because of the lacking of a national strategy, not only to deal with rainfall from above, but water flows from one direction to the other, because we have high points and we have low points in the country. And naturally, water is going to flow in different directions. It doesn't only flow downwards. Now, if it was only flowing downwards, then we would be really lucky, and we can control it from that perspective on each individual location. Right now, the laws only force people to control the water that comes directly down on their location. It doesn't obligate them to be mindful of the natural water flows from one direction to the other, and what their development or their property may do to that natural water flow that can potentially affect somebody else. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think that there's a number of strategies across the world that we can implement on a national level to address these concerns. Being a first world developed country, I don't think that we should be at the stage where people have to be in fear every rainy season. At least many of the places that I've highlighted just now should be in fear every year of this kind of concern, because there is strategies out there that can be implemented and that can be justified by way of fees or implemented taxes to cover it. Because I know that most people will say, you know, at least I know that my property will be covered. I don't mind paying, whether it's an increase in the infrastructure tax or an increase in income duties or whatever the fee structure is necessary to pay for it. Because, Mr. Speaker, I also recognize to implement a national strategy from a scientific and engineering perspective, it's not going to be a cheap exercise based on some of the things that I've researched and I've found that would need to be implemented to make sure that areas that are flood zones are susceptible to major rain, flooding, and storm surge, that those strategies are not going to necessarily be cheap. But I think it's one that the people and the citizens of this country would appreciate, because though today you may be dry, with the lack of approach and focus on flooding and water flows in this country, tomorrow 5 years from now, your property could be full of water because it's not addressed in a proper approach throughout our planning approvals. And I don't think, Mr. Speaker, I want to be accusatory in any way, as in to say the planning department or the minister doesn't care about this matter. But it's time for us to do it, to address this problem, particularly because we're developing so fast. We spoke about the other day about how many planning approvals that was approved just within the last fiscal budget, and the projections for how much construction. And every approval that is approved that goes to planning, Mr. Speaker, could potentially make the matter worse because there's no structured way of dealing with the water flows in this country. And Mr. Speaker, the sad part about it is not too difficult, maybe costly, but it's not difficult, it's not rocket science. We can easily find other strategies that other jurisdictions are doing and use those strategies and implement them here if we are committed to them. And just to speak about some of those types of strategies, Mr. Speaker, you have holding ponds, culvert systems. We have some examples of them, and I would like to actually see a lot more culvert systems in the Cayman Islands to allow those natural water flows to flow where they're flowing to, put in place. You got pumping engines that can pump water from one location to the other. Now, this is where I found some of the biggest expense, but I think the expense versus the safety element of citizens in our society is worth the cost. And I think we got to recognize that the cost is not only coming, it's not coming from the elected members of this House, but the same people that we're protecting. So I think it would be a justified cost if we feel it necessary in order to put these strategies in place. If we need to find the monies to put these strategies in place, I think that the public and the taxpayer can understand these fees. You got gullyways, you got Mr. Speaker, I know but one standing order about disturbance, and I don't want to get it out. Mr. Speaker, all I'm saying here is I've had much conversations with the various different agencies that I think should be involved in creation of a national plan, like the hazard management, the planning, NRA, Department of Environmental Health, Lands and Survey, Water Authority. All of these different agencies have to be in tandem together under one scientific engineered report and suggestions that find these solutions, and they're all working in tandem underneath this, I guess, umbrella of regulations to focus on the flooding problem. Because right now, if everybody's kind of doing their own thing, and I'm hoping that I had an opportunity to pleasantly speak with the minister earlier in respect to, I think that he may say that there is strategies, and I hope to hear what they are, and I'm hoping that my debate will convince him to take this approach. But if there is an approach already within government, I don't think the people within government are aware of it, or the country is aware of it. So I'm not going to get into a debate of bashing. It's too late in the night for that, and the Premier said I need to calm down. So I'm not going to do that. But, Mr. Speaker, I really hope that the response I get to this, because I think everybody here would agree that flooding and strategies to deal with flooding in this country are not comprehensive. We just do ad hoc approaches. I mean, the two things that we know about the most is drains and probably about 7 culvert systems in this country. That is it. And we are as flat of an island as they come. And majority of our island is swamp. So if that's all that we're offering from a national perspective to protect people from flooding, that is a downright shame from a developing country like the Cayman Islands. And the truth is, all of us in this parliament, in this legislative assembly, want the continued success and development for the betterment of our people. But with that development, this issue becomes more and more complicated the longer we deal with it. And Mr. Speaker, I want to highlight something that I've tried to dig back as much as possible into why it hasn't been dealt with before. And I know that most of the seniors in the parliament here probably have remembered the conversation about bringing this up before. And what I found was that every time we got to a stage of discussion about trying to deal with this problem, money was always the issue. And Mr. Speaker, though I respect that, and by all means, money don't grow on trees, but one thing I think we all going to agree with, if you don't deal with it today, it's definitely going to be more expensive tomorrow. If you don't deal with it today, it's going to be harder to fix tomorrow. So it's going to be harder to fix another day, and it's going to be more expensive to fix another day. So I think it's time for us to address it head on in the best interest of our children, because we will eventually run out of land, you know. We don't have it infinite land. And what we're finding, Mr. Speaker, is the difficulty for Caymanians today and the cost of living, they're more likely to buy land as cheap as they possibly can. And Mr. Speaker, that cheap land most times is filled swamp. Because the high rock land is the expensive stuff. So what we're actually doing, setting the future Caymanians up for fail, and the present ones, to be honest with you. Because an average 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom house is at least about $200,000 to $250,000, and the average Caymanian gets paid between $2,000 to $2,500 a month. So they're not going to get into anything over $300,000. That's probably the upper 30%. And because those persons are going to be a higher chance that they're going to buy lands that are susceptible to flooding, we as a government are obligated to protect those who are most vulnerable. And you know something? Most expats that come here usually end up in a pretty good job, and they can afford to buy the good land. And we're subject to having to be forced to buy the swamp stuff. And Mr. Speaker, I think that regardless of who buys the land in this country, we can put a system in play that protects all persons from having to deal with the severity of flooding. Now, Mr. Speaker, by all means, no matter what kind of strategy you put into play, with a natural disaster, there's still potential for flooding. But we can reduce the potential damage of flooding by a very large percent. And I can't even say so because by all means I'm not a specialist in this area. But I know that the other countries are doing exactly what I'm proposing today and have built cities in areas that are considered to be flood zones with the right strategies put in place. So a simple fact that we have Caymanians built in some areas that are considered swamp or low-lying area, you can't say today that there's not strategies available to protect those individuals. And we heard earlier today, Mr. Speaker, that some of those strategies are already under threat. Now, the fact that we don't have a national plan or a national strategy, I don't even know what legislation that the minister is going to use or regulation the minister is going to use to actually stop those private owners from protecting that culvert system. Now, I'm going to give him all the support that I can to find a way to do that, whether it's buy the land or beg the agreement with the landowners. But the truth is, because we have no national plan, no national regulation, they can't stop them. That's why 2 of the culvert systems in South Sound today is now closed off. So until we actually be committed to a national scientific engineered plan that all agencies are working together on with the proper regulations and potentially legislation, we will continue to have this problem. Now, I have some more words, but I think that they can be reserves dependent upon the response by the Honorable Minister. So I'll hold back. I think, but we all get the premise of what I'm trying to say. It's time for us to deal with this and deal with it now for the future. All right? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? The Honorable Minister of Commerce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, just to provide a bit of background and a little context to the subject, there was a multi-agency review of this issue in 2003, Mr. Speaker, for which a brief report was produced. Mr. Speaker, the Storm Management Committee, or the SWMC, was established by directives from the Honorable Minister of Planning, Communications, Works, and Information Technology to make recommendations to the government on a comprehensive approach to stormwater management and related flooding and drainage issues facing, in particular, Grand Cayman. The committee was comprised of a wide cross-section including administrators, highway engineers, research scientists, urban planners, and water resource engineers. Mr. Speaker, the SWMC recommended that government actively seek to implement a stormwater management plan for Grand Cayman that address the planning, institutional, and structural elements of stormwater management on a short, medium, and long-term basis. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, this was not undertaken as it was then considered cost prohibitive and there was no strategic plan for its implementation. Since that time, Mr. Speaker, the National Roads Authority has essentially attended to its own matter of drainage as it relates to the roads. Meanwhile, Mr. Speaker, the Planning Department, in consultation with NRA, has come up with draft stormwater guidelines in an effort to have new developments seeking planning permission deal with their own water on site. The Planning Department, in consultation with the National Roads Authority, has come up with draft stormwater guidelines in an effort to have new developments seeking planning permission deal with their own water on site. In other words, each time you submit a plan, you have to submit a stormwater management plan to go with it. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, this approach does not solve the issue and indeed may hinder natural drainage occurrences and/or patterns. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, the issue may be exasperated. In fact, it is exasperated by new developments blocking and/or filling in some of the old MRCU dikes. Mr. Speaker, whilst these were originally built for mosquito control purposes, they also had the added benefit of doubling as drainage canal basins. Mr. Speaker, inland development, however, has reduced the need for these dikes as the swamps that they were draining or adding the salt water to have been developed on, and therefore the need for the dikes becomes irrelevant. Mr. Speaker, the ministry through the National Roads Authority have managed to reduce flood occurrences in some areas by going from 6-inch diameter wells to 10-inch diameter wells and increasing the catchment basin from 2 feet by 2 feet by 2 feet to a 3 by 3 by 3. Mr. Speaker, this only works in areas where the substrata is pervious and the water table is low. However, Mr. Speaker, we found the deep wells to be mostly ineffective in areas where the ground is less than 4 feet above mean sea level. As a result, Mr. Speaker, it has been difficult to comprehensively address areas that the member listed, well, he listed out most of the island actually, but some of those, Washington Boulevard, North Sound Estates, Windsor Park area, Randike Gardens, Cumber Avenue. But having said that, Mr. Speaker, the government has been mitigating individual areas as best as possible in the short term. And for example, Mr. Speaker, we have increased, where we had $80,000 in this year's budget out of recurrent funds spent on wells. And the ministry has funded an additional via its EA 36 for 51 redrills and 21 new drains plumbed. Mr. Speaker, the cost on these wells are about $3,000 per well and $1,700 per a redrill. I think as a member spoke about the different areas, he would have found that we have also been partnering with the Mesquite MRCU in areas that they still have the dikes, and we've reinstituted a few of the culverts where NRA have built roads across those dikes. A recent effort on the Esler-Tibbetts bypass to clean out the dikes and to ensure that the culverts were clear led to a vast reduction in the flooding around the Washington Boulevard area, the Georgetown Courts area. We are also working along with the residents in North Sound Estates, where we have a whole new issue there, Mr. Speaker, where the tide actually brings the salt water up through the drains. So we've had to cap the drains, but we've taken site levels, and we're currently working on a plan to try and follow the natural grade and channel the water back to the ocean somehow. We have the same issue in Prospect, where we have an entire street that goes, the end of the street goes underwater. Wells are useless there as well. We're working on a plan to either work along with the neighboring private properties to drain the water off and then eventually out to the North Sound, or to find a way to drain it to the North Sound ourselves. Mr. Speaker, we have also been identifying some areas where we could possibly purchase low-lying properties to dig holding wells and to drain the waters and put levees around those and create catchment basins with large industrial wells if the sea level or the water level there allows us to do so. The member spoke about natural disasters and engineering that would help avert those. I tidal surge, Mr. Speaker. I don't know if we will find an engineer that can help us avoid tidal surge without building a wall around the island, but I look at just Venice, I think one of the most well-engineered cities on water. 80% of Venice was underwater last month from a tidal surge from a subtropical storm. So we will continue, and I know that the hazard management, along with Public Works Department, every year we get together and the National Roads Authority. I had the privilege this year of seeing them in action, and they roll out a plan across the island and set up a communication center and secure all of the government properties, all essential properties, the hurricane shelters, and they have a plan when it comes to moving people, alleviating flooding from the rainwater, etc. Mr. Speaker, since taking office, my ministry and the NRA have been actively discussing this issue. And it is now recognized that with the vast changes in the topography of the island since the initial report was done in 2003, due to the development that has taken place over the last few years, it is our intention to appoint a new committee to update the 2003 report. Mr. Speaker, this is a complex, tedious, and expensive process, but we are committed to finding the best solution for the situation. Mr. Speaker, in addition to updating the 2003 plan, it is our intention to develop a strategic implementation plan. Whether we phase that by district, whether we phase that by the immediate needs, by some sort of rating system as to which areas are worst affected, we'll have to work that out. But at least if we put together an implementation plan, and even if we have to do it over a period of several years, as they say, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with the first step. Mr. Speaker, once the revised document is complete, we will make sure that it is utilized by the Central Planning Authority for its decisions on future projects. I also, Mr. Speaker, thank the member for identifying the concerns on the culverts, and we have already in the ministry today started to discuss and look at ways in which we can secure the culverts that we currently have in place and work along with future developers to ensure that these culverts aren't cut off or filled in, so that we can continue to drain those low-lying areas until future development happen in those areas, and then we'll have to evolve from there to see what the next plan would be, because there's no way that we're going to come up with a fix-it-all. As a member rightfully said, when we develop areas, as areas become developed and some become higher than others, we will have runoff, and the runoff, we can guess where it would go based on the topography today. But that topography is ever evolving as each development happens. But I feel confident that with an updated management plan and the continued cooperation of the National Roads Authority and the Central Planning Authority, we will continue to ensure that we mitigate any chances of flooding in the best way we can. Mr. Speaker, in saying all that I have just said, at this time, the government feels that it is on the right track to addressing the issue, and I can assure the member that I am committed to the plan outlined here this evening. And so, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for his efforts. We did have a conversation. He has done quite a bit of research. As he pointed out himself, many of the examples that were drawn on were examples of places that have issues with mountains and the rainfall and the water from the mountains, rivers, levees, places that have unique situations. Cayman in itself is unique in that majority of the island is below sea level. We have no mountains, we have no rivers, and we rely on the natural runoff either to the ocean or into the low-lying areas, the swamp areas as we commonly call them. In fact, I think, Mr. Speaker, my personal opinion is that whilst we're often teased in the region about being so flat, thank God for that during Hurricane Ivan, that the water just ran right off of us and right over us. Because had we had mountains and rivers, we would have been in a real conundrum, as we say. Dog eat our supper. So I thank the member. At this time, the government feels that we are on the right track. We will continue to work towards updating the 2003 plan, and we thank him for bringing some of the issues to light, but at this time the government will not be supporting the motion as it's moved. Mr. Speaker, it would be remiss of me at this time, this late in the hurricane season, for me to sit down without thanking and recognizing the hard work of the NRA employees who, during the heaviest rains and the worst times, when I call, they're already on the road. When I call and say, have you checked in this area? Yes, sir, we've been there. Have you checked in this area? And I think members can attest that when they call me, within very short time, the NRA team is there to assist with the flooding issues and doing the hard work that no one wants to do, and to be very honest with you, without very little appreciation. So it would be remiss of me if I had not taken a moment to thank them for their work during these trying times as we get the heavy rains and the risk of hurricanes, and we work to keep all of the drains clear and vacuumed and free of impediments so that the water can drain off as quickly as possible, and persons can get about their daily lives without having to wade through waist-high water. So with those few words, Mr. Speaker, I thank you. And again, I thank the member for his spirit of cooperation in bringing the motion, and I look forward to working with him as we implement the government's plan. Thank you.
Member from Savannah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm comforted by the minister's comments in regards to updating the 2003 flooding plan, or whatever they were preparing on, and all of us that has been around here for a while. And Mr. Speaker, you well remember the problems with Randike Garden, where the government has spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to help those people out flooding and so on. And I know the minister, was it yesterday, mentioned that some of these culverts were blocked. But I see a situation like this almost as a national importance coming out, especially down in that area, and the closest way to drain that water is in the South Sound. It must be preserved some way or the other. I want to thank the minister, my colleague from Georgetown Central, for bringing this. And you and I, Mr. Minister, has had some discussions, but I see your head of NRA is there, so I just want to put a few pointers in and save you having to send the email to his colleagues. Unfortunately, going into 18 months, I've been waiting on 3 or 4, I know, and I was in the presence of some of your colleagues last season when they had the opportunity to get 10 put in certain areas. And here I am, sucking high and tit again, and not getting the service. And I'm speaking on behalf of my colleague from Bordentown East, Belford Estates. I need not tell you, and I know he's worked on it from when he was there the last time, and they're working on it now. I don't know. I think one of the biggest problems there, and also behind Gun Square, where they put in Anton Borden Drive, they once again didn't put in the culverts to lead the water back there, which would then simply drain in, as we talked about earlier, into the Duck Pond area. This is one of the areas I mentioned to you about North Sound Gardens. It's really into the entrance to that. That's one of the places I requested adjoining North Sound Estates. Just recently, the road on Hearst Road, just before you get to Butterfly Circle, they built a big house under the side of the road. And I mentioned to some of the employees of the NRA about the problem there. Just before you get to Butterfly Circle, it's impossible for a person to walk past there without climbing up on the land there. Or, matter of fact, that last heavy rain some time ago, people were shuttling, using trucks and vehicles to get the people across that area. So I'm asking and begging the urgency of that. I also submitted one in Savannah Meadows, it's Ellicott Avenue, and it's 20C247, if they could look at dealing with that. But I understand and I do know, Mr. Minister, that if you've given a commitment to review this, I'm sure it brings comfort also to the mover of this motion. I do not believe in reinventing the wheel if it's something there that you can build on, but Master knows that we have dealt with this flooding problem from time Jesus was on Rivera Beach, and I think we need to at least, even if it's in a specific area, Georgetown, North Sound, or wherever, do it in sections to try out and see what can happen. And they talk about polluting the thing there. After Norwester, when you go out here or anywhere else, there's nothing but mud and stuff out there. That'll drain off and go away. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Does the mover wish to wind up at this time?
Mr. Speaker, can I crave your indulgence just for 2 seconds, please? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Georgetown Central.
I'm going to be rather short. And I want to first start off by saying thank you so much for the minister's contribution, as well as the elected senior of the House, or one of the seniors of the House, the member from Savannah, as well as my seconder for this motion, at least to bring to the attention of the administration that this matter needs to be addressed. I am pleased to hear that the government intends to revitalize basically what I hope to have done within this motion through that report. And therefore, it is my intention, Mr. Speaker, to withdraw the motion rather than to have it voted on, to have a level of difference in vote and who is against who and all that. It seems that we're both on the same page, and I appreciate the minister's approach to that. I just ask that to give us a little bit of timelines in these types of things, because I still have to do my job, which is to hold the government accountable for those things. So if we're going to fix up that report, perfect. All right, Mr. Speaker, with that being said, I want to thank the minister for that, and I think we're both on the same page to alleviate the flooding issues for many Caymanians in this country, and I look forward to the updates on that report in short order. So therefore, I withdraw the motion. Mr. Speaker, with your permission, sir, I would like to move a motion to withdraw the current motion standing in my name under order paper, motion number 5, 2018. I was supposed to get on my knees? I just joked. I beg to move the motion, Mr. Speaker, to withdraw motion number 5 on the order paper standing in my name.
The question is seconded by the seconder.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to second the motion.
Seconded. Want to make sure that we are you're withdrawing the motion, which was be therefore resolved that the government considers creating a national flood management plan, and be it further resolved that the government consider allocating resources to implement and execute the national flood management plan, including the requisite legislation, regulation, and policies. Your member withdrawing.
Yes,
the
that's correct.
question is that motion, private member's motion, number 5, 2018-2019, National Flood Management Plan, be withdrawn. All in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. The motion has been withdrawn. Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, before I move the adjournment motion, I just want to signal to members that on Monday, the Minister of Financial Services and I have a critically important meeting in the morning, and I would therefore propose, Mr. Speaker, that we do not commence proceedings here until 2 o'clock on Monday. I'm giving members as much notice as I can. Mr. Speaker, with that, I move the adjournment of this Honorable House until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning.
Question is that this Honorable House do now adjourn until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, Friday morning. All in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. This Honorable Assembly stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning.